Something that always amazes me is how quickly politicians can warn us all about socialism on one hand, while quietly expanding government control with the other. And honestly, that's exactly what seems to be happening in America today. Now, don't get me wrong. The government isn't taking over every industry like pure socialism. But that doesn't mean that our liberty, and most importantly, or more relevantly, our free market system isn't taking another significant hit. In fact, what's going on today might actually be more subtle. So, what am I talking about that's so dangerous? I'm talking about the slow creep of total socialism. Since January 2025, the federal government has reportedly acquired ownership interests totaling roughly $27 billion across 30 different companies. Now, think about that for a second. When politicians start buying pieces of private businesses with taxpayer money, are we really living with free markets anymore? Or are we drifting toward an economy that looks something more like pure socialism, where success depends less on satisfying consumers and more on satisfying Washington, D.C.? Take Intel as an example. After the government announced it would purchase a 10% ownership stake in the company, Intel stock jumped significantly. Now, some people might celebrate that, but I look at it and ask, why did the stock rise? Was it because Intel suddenly became better at serving consumers? Or was it because investors assumed government ownership created a kind of unofficial government guarantee? That's a huge difference. In a genuine free market, capital naturally flows toward businesses that earn it by creating better products, lowering prices, and serving customers. But once government starts picking favorites, investors naturally chase politically connected companies instead. That means less capital goes to entrepreneurs who might actually innovate and outperform the politically favored firms. All in all, consumers lose, workers lose, and economic growth slows. And businesses learn a terrible lesson. Instead of capitalism where you compete harder, they learn don't compete harder, instead lobby harder. And here's another problem people often overlook. Government investment isn't just about writing checks. Government ownership almost always comes with government influence. Once politicians become shareholders, business decisions inevitably become political decisions. Executives start asking themselves, will this keep Washington happy? Instead of, will this make us more profitable on the free market? This is a recipe for inefficiency, wasted resources, and decisions driven by politics instead of economics and the forces of supply and demand. What's especially surprising is the political response. Republicans have spent years warning about growing socialism, especially a growing socialist wing within the Democratic Party. They've criticized figures like Bernie Sanders and Mamdani for advocating larger government involvement in the economy. And they've been justified in these criticisms. Yet, when government itself starts buying ownership stakes in private businesses, most Republicans have been remarkably quiet because it's been Republicans doing it. In fact, Senate Republicans have gone a step further. The fiscal year 2027 National Defense Authorization Act includes a provision creating what's called the Defense Equity Investment Account. Under this proposal, the Pentagon could invest up to $500 million in companies producing batteries, critical minerals, materials, and chemicals. And in return, the Defense Department would receive ownership interests in those companies. This is not free market capitalism. Of course, Supporters argue this is only about protecting national security and ensuring reliable military supply chains. And on the surface, that may sound reasonable to most people. But history teaches a lesson that's hard to ignore. Time and time again, government expansions begin as temporary, limited, or emergency measures. They're introduced as narrow exceptions, and they slowly, however, become permanent features of government power. Once the principle is accepted that government can own pieces of private businesses because it's supposedly necessary, it becomes much harder to object when future politicians want to expand that same authority into new industries or for entirely different reasons. Now, I don't think it's accurate entirely to call this pure socialism. Like I said earlier, words matter. What we're really talking about here is corporatism. It might be approaching pure socialism, but right now it's corporatism, a system where businesses remained privately owned on paper, but government exercises growing influence over how they're run. So it may not be pure socialism, but it's a form of socialism because there's not actual private property ownership by business owners anymore in the purest sense of the word. They might look like the owners of the means of production, but in reality, it's the government in the background telling them what to do with their businesses, telling them what to do with their capital. Private ownership exists, but political power increasingly shapes economic outcomes. From a libertarian perspective, that's deeply troubling because free markets depend on voluntary exchange, private property, competition, and consumer choice, not political favoritism and taxpayer-funded ownership stakes. Markets work best when entrepreneurs succeed by creating value, not by attracting and lobbying government investment. And here's the irony that really stands out to me. If Republicans ultimately authorize this policy through the NDAA, the one I just talked about, they'll be embracing the very principle of socialism that they've spent years criticizing the Democrats for. They'll be supporting government using taxpayer dollars to obtain ownership and influence over private enterprise. Whether the intention is national security or industrial policy, the precedent is the same. As Friedrich Hayek famously warned, quote, "The more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual," end quote. Every new expansion of government control makes voluntary economic decision-making just a little bit smaller. So the real question isn't whether one investment is justified. The real question is whether we want to normalize the idea that Washington, the government, should be able to become a shareholder in America's private economy. Because once that door is opened, and it's been creaking open for years and decades now, it didn't just start with Trump, but once that door is opened, history suggests it rarely swings shut. For those of us who believe that prosperity comes purely from the private sector, from entrepreneurship, competition, voluntary exchange, and the discipline of the marketplace, not political capital, that should be a conversation worth having before the next government investment becomes the next permanent government power.